Greetings, everyone. I'm Robert Delaney. I'm the U.S. Bureau Chief with the South China Morning Post. I am honored to be here at the Cato Institute in downtown Washington, D.C. with Clark Packard, a specialist here in trade and economics, and also Eric Gomez, specialist in defense and foreign policy. We're going to have a discussion about what things are going to look like as we move into a new administration and how the new Trump administration will look in terms of U.S. policy towards China and the bilateral relationship in general. So anyway, it's an honor for me to be here, gentlemen. Thank you so much for the invite. I always look forward to your insights as we do our reporting. So maybe I would just sort of kick it off with a pretty broad question about what signals are you guys seeing so far in terms of what we're hearing from either President-elect Trump himself or anyone in particular from his administration? And so what are you picking up on in terms of how things will look in the second term?
I think on the defense and foreign policy issues, we're going to see, I don't want to quite say more of the same, but I think that there is this general consensus between Trump and the Biden administration and the first Trump administration on generally competitive, generally hawkish policies towards China. That doesn't mean there won't be differences, because I think there will be. But I feel like that is such an ingrained foreign policy consensus within the Congress, among Trump's picks for his cabinet and national security advisor, that kind of potential for tension will continue. I think the big area of difference is I don't think Biden or Biden's team could credibly get any sort of deal done with China. It doesn't really matter what the specifics of that deal are or what they might be under Trump yet. But any kind of serious quid pro quo or serious exchange of policy behaviors or change in behavior, I don't think Biden was ever going to get that. He was too hawkish. He's too, not only hawkish, but very much caught up in this democracy versus autocracy framework, and I would argue more zero-sum thinking. I think for Trump, you'll still have that competitiveness, but there might be a chance for some kind of deal-making. Again, what the specifics of that deal-making might be, who knows? I certainly don't. But I think there is some potential there that didn't exist for the last 4 years.
Clark, any thoughts on your end?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think so far it's been kind of a mixed bag, right? On the trade side, the president-elect has been incredibly hawkish. We're talking about 60% tariffs on all imports from China. But then softer on issues like TikTok and Taiwan, for example. During the campaign, he talked about how Taiwan, was stealing our semiconductor industry. But at the same time, as Eric mentioned, if you look at the appointments, right, Rubio at the State Department, Mike Waltz as NSA, Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense, Jamison Greer at USTR, Bridge Colby as Undersecretary of Defense. These are all hawkish guys. They're all, they're not sort of shrinking violets. But then I think, folks like Bessent are going to be more pragmatic in terms of their approach, if only because of their portfolio, right, in terms of, maintaining financial stability, perhaps a little more pragmatic and willing to cut deals. And I also think there's a big question on the economic side, how much influence somebody like Elon Musk has, right? He has substantial ties in China. And I think that his voice, again, it's sort of up in the air at this point, but if he has a pretty heavy say in what the economic policy is going to be, it might be a little more dovish than otherwise if he weren't involved. So.
I mean, bringing up Elon Musk is sort of interesting because there's quite a bit of controversy over the extent to which he is acting as an advisor. And of course, we know that the bipartisan consensus on China is very anti-China. And so How do you think the Elon Musk factor will play out in that? We've already seen that Musk has got a bit burned by the positions he was taking on immigration, right? He really kind of stuck his neck out saying this is necessary for us, and there was quite a backlash from Trump's sort of core base. So do you think he's going to be more cautious as the administration starts in terms of trying to advocate for negotiation with Beijing?
Yeah, I think that he's just, he symbolizes something more broadly, which is I think the U.S. Tech sector in particular is going to run up headlong into sort of conflict with the more hawkish folks. The tech sector obviously wants to be able to continue to sell as many semiconductors as they can to China. And so, I see there's a potential fissure and potential areas for, I guess, some internal conflict in the sort of upper echelons of the Trump administration.
So technology, of course, bleeds a lot into the defense space, and we've seen effort after initiative after effort by the Biden administration to stop China's ability to acquire technologies that will advance the China's defense capabilities. So, Eric, maybe you could talk a little bit about, as we go into the new administration, what are your thoughts on the new administration's thinking in terms of, were all of these initiatives, the export restrictions, the small yard, high fence, what's your take on what they're thinking about all of these initiatives, and have they been effective, and will they sort of pick up where the Biden administration left off, or is there a chance that they're just going to take a completely different direction on this?
Yeah, I think a lot of this depends on how they view that question of emerging technology as via the military lens or via the sort of general economic and trade lens. If you view it primarily through the military lens, it makes easier to make those arguments for cutting off and small yard high fencing it and trying to create this system. I was actually struck by the map that the administration released of sort of the countries that you can sort of do exports of sensitive chip technology to, the places you can't, and the places in the middle. And everyone says, oh, we're not in a Cold War with China, right? We're not in this new Cold War. Lay that map over a map of alignment of states during the Cold War. And it's remarkably similar, which is kind of funny. But I think that the new administration, I think the focus on the defense side, it might have that aspect of trying to cut China off. It's difficult to gauge how successful that's actually been, because a lot of China's military tech has gotten a lot better, in part because China's domestic tech ecosystem has gotten a lot better. And yes, that has come with some IP or software or things from the United States, but I think we shouldn't also be so... I think it's also a danger in saying it's only getting this way because they have access to U.S. technology and equipment, right? Or U.S. dual-use systems. I don't think that's I think the majority of it is the improvement in the Chinese industrial capacity and manufacturing capacity. And when you talk about like the threat to Taiwan, or what about the PLA makes the U.S. military nervous, yes, there's cutting edge aspects or emerging tech aspects of that. A lot of it's just distance and mass, right? Any conflict that would happen would be in China's backyard. The U.S. is at an inherent disadvantage because of the distances involved, and China has a lot of stuff. It has the largest navy in the world by ship count, and so figuring out how to deal with that. Yes, the tech controls, that helps maybe, but I think there's bigger challenges about U.S. ability to manufacture things like munitions, ability to get weapons to allies on time, that sort of thing, that are much more fundamental to this question of deterring Chinese aggression or military action in Asia that the tech stuff plays into, but we're talking about like I see that in like a 10 to 20 year time horizon, when we'll actually start to see the fruits of that come to bear, but not on a next 4 year time horizon.
Okay, so what I heard from that a little bit is that, okay, tech restrictions have played some role in limiting the development of whatever it is that the U.S. national security folks are afraid of China developing, but
Probably,
but overall, the China is just forging ahead.
The concern, and the concerns that you have with the Chinese military now don't change because all that stuff's already been made, right? Like China poses a difficult military and defense question to the United States right now, even without even with these things getting cut off, and will continue to do so. The nature of that challenge might change over a longer time horizon because of the technology controls. But I don't think that it makes a meaningful impact on the here and now.
Okay. So we have, if sticking with technology and sort of prognosticating about what the incoming Trump administration will do, technology, obviously, it straddles defense and also just straight up economic issues. So any thoughts about, let me back up a second. In the first Trump term, that's where we started with the list, the entity list, and obviously the tariff war, and concern about China acquiring technologies that would ultimately undermine U.S. national security interests. Where do you think, knowing that Trump is he's a deal maker, he's interested in competitiveness, do you think that that's going to erode somewhat his resolve in Trump 2.0? Will we see less of an emphasis on using tools that will restrict trade and will restrict investment in the U.S. and investment flows in general, two-way investment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the broader point. I think some retrenchment was inevitable, right? I think economics is continuously subordinated to broader national security and geopolitics in the relationship. But at the same time, right, there's been some continuity. Biden maintained the tariffs, has been pretty aggressive on export control. I think it's interesting, right? I think that the Biden administration has put forward a pretty aggressive plan on outbound investment screening in China. That's an area I think that Trump would certainly support, right? He wants more investment. His argument would be, why are these firms in the U.S. investing in China? They should be investing in capacity in the U.S. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, but ultimately, yes, he is a deal maker, and he's a classic mercantilist. He values exports and building things for the world. And so I think, if you're talking about semiconductors or some technology, there is going to be a part of him that says, wait a second, like, our companies depend on reaching customers. We need to continue to grow the economy. They need to be able to send more of their products to China. And at the same time, right, you are going to get pushback from the more hawkish national security voices saying, whoa, this is propping up the Chinese military for the reasons that you and Eric have been discussing.
So, the national security voices will say, hang on, we can't do this. But we know that Trump he has a track record of disregarding advice from policymakers. When he feels that it's necessary in the moment. How much leeway do you think, and this is a question for both of you, how much leeway do you think he's going to have? Or how much determination do you think he's going to have to say, I've talked to the hand with this stuff?
I think this is the area where the personnel and the people around him are really going to make a big difference, because in the first Trump administration, there was still a lot of people who were, you'd consider more, right, like establishment Republicans or neocons. Right? He had John Bolton as his NSA, not initially, but for a couple of years in the middle there. Jim Mattis as the first Secretary of Defense. Mike Flynn, although he didn't last, I think, as long. And so you had a team around him that still had a lot of those sort of not MAGA voices, right? Those more sort of established voices. And from a lot of reporting and books that have come out about that first term, it sounds like there were several issues where there was resistance from folks in the administration bureaucracy against what the president wanted. Whether or not you regard that resistance as a good or a bad thing sort of depends issue to issue area. But that was the fact of the matter. From the team he's assembling now, I think that will be much less of a factor in the second term. I think that means the bureaucracy is going to be doing what the president wants. And so that aspect of him kind of ignoring advice or sort of doing something against what the experts, or like what in the first term it was like the adults in the room are trying to tell him, I don't think that's going to happen as much in the second term, because it's not his first rodeo, and because the people around him, I think, are people that he personally seems to trust more. Like, he's not sort of outsourcing this search to establish Republican interests like he did the first time around. Which again, is that a good or a bad thing for foreign policy? I will not weigh in on good or bad, because it depends, I think, on where you come down on that. But I don't think that will be as much of an issue in the second term.
So then if in his second term, if he's less likely to listen to the foreign policy establishment, what does this mean for the lattice work of alliances with allies and partners that we saw develop? Either AUKUS, the new one that was established under Biden, Quad, which was actually resurrected in Trump 1.0. What does it mean for these alliances?
I suspect that Trump won't. I think the lattice work arrangement of all these different sort of multilateral emerging institutions or cooperations will probably be weakened. However, that does not equate to like an abandonment of Asia. I think from Trump himself and the people he surrounds himself with, he's going to want to still play China competitively. But from what we saw in the first term and things of that nature, he is not going to be as sort of deferential to allied interests or deferential to, well, I just need to make this alliance relationship work. I think he's going to press, right? I think he's going to say, hey, you need to spend more if you want us to do more. And I'm kind of fine with that because I think those countries in Asia have been slacking a bit on that and need to sort of do more to get up to speed. But I don't think that's going to mean I think all of the current treaty alliances are fine. Nothing's going to happen to them. Taiwan, I imagine we're going to see an effort on increasing arms sales to Taiwan, but sort of higher level political browbeating of Taipei to get their defense spending in order. The Australians, I think he'll have a good relationship with them, especially if they can spin AUKUS as this kind of like good for the American worker angle of like increasing submarine manufacturing in the defense industrial base. But things like the Quad or these other kind of mini-lateral, multilateral efforts, they might go by the wayside a bit, because I think that is less important to Trump politically than sort of making sure that these alliance relationships are, like paying up and taking more bigger action to demonstrate we listen to you, or we're listening to you on this question of burden sharing.
So I do want to come back to the defense industrial base, but first, Clark, if I could turn to you to ask a similar question about what are we going to see in 2.0, but Trump 2.0, but with respect to the Chips and Science Act. Let's turn to that one. This, a very wide-ranging effort with a lot of government subsidies involved in bringing advanced chip making to the U.S. Because of supply chain difficulties that they experienced. Where do you see that standing in Trump 2.0?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. On the campaign trail, right, the president-elect talked about the problems with the CHIPS Act. Oh, it was a boondoggle, it's a mistake, we're going to get rid of it. But when you go and look at support in Congress, obviously, the Cato Institute and I've been very critical of industrial policy, but that bill enjoyed pretty wide bipartisan support in Congress, and Senator Todd Young, for example, from Indiana, was the lead Republican co-sponsor on that bill. So I think it's a different sell trying to unwind it through Congress. You'd still need to get 60 votes in the Senate to undo it. So I think there's more bipartisan support for it. It's standing on stronger legs in Congress. I start to wonder, right? Bob Lighthizer, for example, Trump's USTR, said he was broadly supportive of that concept. I wonder whether Trump was just critical of it for campaign purposes, or if he actually felt like it was a mistake. My sense is it was just a campaign ploy, because it facilitates the reshoring, or in theory, facilitates the reshoring of domestic manufacturing in the U.S., which Trump ostensibly supports. So I think that, I generally think the CHIPS Act will probably continue. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, subsidies, the other portion of the industrial policy, I think that's on shakier ground. There's not as much Republican support, for example, to maintain those subsidies. So.
Right. And I picked up when you said, the act is meant to, in theory, bring manufacturing back to the U.S. So what's your, in theory, yes, but in actual practice, is it having the intended result? Is it going in that direction, or is it sort of a mixed bag? I mean, and sorry, to follow up on that, do you have any further thoughts about whether it's Trump or anyone else in the administration, what they might be thinking about the results so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a little too early to tell. Conversely, right, are you creating sort of a sugar high, right? We're dumping a ton of money to build these facilities in Arizona, for example. But again, I think the history of industrial policy, the ability of a government bureaucrat to kind of figure out where the market is going and predict that, I think it doesn't have a very strong track record. But, again, there seems to be a bipartisan consensus in favor of it. And if you're willing to dump a ton of money, I mean, right, you can grow oranges in, I don't know, Detroit if you want to. You just have to subsidize the hell out of it to make it happen.
Right.
And I think that gets back to something I mentioned before about do you view that sort of tech competition through the economic lens or the security lens? Because if you view it through the security lens, then these sort of more wasteful, from an economic standpoint, actions to try and do industrial policy can get justified through that security aspect. Mm-hmm. But if it's more about economic competitiveness and trying to grow the economy, then there's a tension there, right? And I think that the tension hasn't been felt too overtly yet because it's still kind of early goings. But as time passes and the fabs get completed in Arizona and elsewhere, it's the consequences of that will start to be felt. And then the question of, will it be politically sustainable to keep doing things like the CHIPS Act, or to change because of economic reasons?
So going back to, I think you mentioned something about the possibility of wasteful spending, and also touching again on defense industrial base. One of the big issues that comes up a lot in congressional hearings and analyses among defense policymakers is shipyards in the U.S. The U.S. has basically almost completely lost shipbuilding capacity.
Yeah.
We see there's so much information out there about how much that has grown in China. How do you think Trump is going to respond to coming into the Oval Office? How is he going to respond to these warnings and flashing red lights about the lack of shipbuilding capacity in the U.S.? Where do you see that going in Trump 2.0? For Eric, and then if you have any thoughts, Clark.
I think there's sort of a tactical military way to solve this problem is you think about how to offset Chinese numerical advantages in ships without building ships. Right? We offset Russian numerical advantages in tanks and armored vehicles in the late Cold War, not by building more tanks necessarily, but by building more precise munitions to counter the tanks. And I think that it's interesting recently to see the rise of people who are tied to these sort of newer defense industrial companies that aren't, your Lockheeds, your Boeings, right? Your big primes that have kind of gobbled up through mergers and acquisitions all these other smaller places, that has led to a lot of complaints about cost increases and lack of competitiveness. I think that there are, with David Sachs, with David Sachs coming into the admin, and folks kind of like him and the sort of the VC or that kind of disruptive technology mindset or background. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with DoD acquisition of things like unmanned systems or cheaper, but maybe more numerous and easier to produce types of munitions to counter this shipbuilding advantage, right? Like that is one way you could do it relatively quickly. It has all kinds of other issues, which I won't get into too much here because it might be boring, but tactically you could do that. On the shipbuilding side in the United States, it sounds like, I can't remember if Trump himself said it recently or if it was Rubio in his confirmation hearing, but someone pretty senior, either the president himself or someone at the cabinet level, has recently said, we might need to look to friendly countries like South Korea or Japan to supplement the shipbuilding or the naval shipbuilding aspects, or to do something to help them bring their capacity more towards us, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think fixing American shipbuilding problems in general, you should, for everyone watching at home, check out Cato's work on trying to take out the Jones Act and Scott Lincecum's work, because that's really good stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is this what, there's the Pentagon's Replicator Initiative, for example, where it's about, there was a comment that Admiral Paparo, I think, made last year about turning, if there's a Taiwan contingency, they're going to turn it into a sort of an unmanned hellscape.
Yep.
I think was the comment that he used. I mean, is that a realistic assessment of what could possibly happen at this point? And so keeping the discussion focused in Trump 2.0, how do you think that's going to develop?
Yeah. So my own issue with Replicator is I think Replicator makes a lot more sense for the countries that are in Asia, right? Japan and Taiwan. Replicator makes a ton of sense for Taiwan, right? The problem with Replicator for the US military is that at the distances you are operating under in Asia, you kind of need to have the really high-end stuff. You kind of need your F-35s. The unmanned stuff won't really cut it because you don't have as much land that you can base this stuff on to do the shorter range operations. So I think Replicator for the US military in Asia might not be as big of a sort of strategic needle mover. But if it leads to, hey, we've invested in R&D on a bunch of this sort of unmanned stuff, that we can then sell to the Taiwanese or sell to the Japanese, etc. That is where I think the sort of strategic, effectiveness could really pay off. And it could. And, I think that this is where you have this interesting kind of question of, what makes the most sense for the defense of Taiwan and countries in Asia that are menaced by China, and what makes the most sense for the American military might be different things because of geography, and who the defense industrial base is building for might be an interesting and kind of complicated question.
Right. So I could see that perhaps Trump, the entrepreneur, would be happy to have sort of more advanced technology that you would see in the Replicator Initiative, because then that would allow them to, commercially, build markets. And so I guess maybe, Clark, do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, look, I think that I can certainly see a desire within the Trump administration to do more industrial policy on shipbuilding, for example. I would caution, however, that the U.S. has limited fiscal capacity, right? Bond yields are rising. It's increasingly likely that the U.S. is running out of fiscal capacity. We're talking about, extending tax cuts at a time where we've also taken off the board, legitimate spending restraint on, Medicare, Social Security, the entitlement programs. And so, all this waste that they're going to cut is from an increasingly narrow slice of the budget that's just not going to get you the kind of revenue, both on the tax side and on the spending restraint side, to kind of bring the fiscal capacity back more in line. It's just not sustainable to continue to run $1 trillion+ deficits every single year. And try to be sort of, a primacist in the world, right? Taking a more aggressive position abroad is costly. And I think that there's a capacity issue long term for the U.S.
If I could add a final thought on this. So, relating back to the primacy point, one interesting kind of big picture thing about the second Trump administration is that, the United States has been trying to do this pivot to Asia for about almost 15 years now, I think, right? The Obama administration said we're going to focus more attention, militarily, economically, all this stuff in Asia. Didn't really happen. Biden was talking about doing that more too, and it didn't really happen. Trump round one was talking about trying to do that more as well. We've had this problem where we keep getting pulled off by other things happening in other parts of the world. Currently, that's Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, and the potential of escalation with Iran. I do wonder if Trump, because he seems willing to reduce American involvement, especially in Europe, but potentially also in the Middle East, if that makes this concept of the pivot to Asia actually working more credible, right? And how might that play into Chinese calculations of, if a deal is to be had, if some sort of arrangement is to be made with the United States, I might want to make that now before the gaze shifts and more assets come in potentially. So I think Trump might be able to not repeat the sort of strategic mistakes that the last, his first administration, Obama and Biden have all done, where I agree, Asia needs to be the priority theater. Asia needs to be the focus. And no one's really been able to successfully follow through on that because they see something happen and they're like, I have to fix that and take my eye off the ball. Which has worked pretty well for China. Make its rise pretty easy. I think Trump round two, maybe. I don't want to be too zero-sum about it myself. I think he might have that ability to not be distracted by the shiny thing happening somewhere else because he doesn't care as much about needing to preserve the cross-Atlantic solidarity or something.
Right.
So, if you're an Asia-focused person like me, that sounds pretty great. If you're an Atlanticist, it's probably not so great. But I do think that is an interesting aspect of this incoming administration that could have all kinds of implications for Chinese calculations and how we go about doing things in the region ourselves. Great.
Well, listen, I've got some questions coming in, several good questions. One just sort of caught my eye. And let's think of this question in the context of the incoming administration. But is there any school of thought or political model in which a peaceful coexistence and cooperation between the PRC and the US is at least an option? And what would it entail to get there? Clark, did you want to?
Sure.
Start with that one?
Look, I mean,
entrepreneurship.
My hope is that yes, right, that you can have some sort of peaceful coexistence, right? Because I think people talk in really blasé terms about this. Because if you get into a hot war, you're talking about, real devastation, right? Like, and then concerns about the economy are just so secondary. My hope has been about the U.S.-China relationship, that you're not going to agree on certain issues, right? We're not going to agree on human rights. We're not going to agree on, the Taiwan question. I think maybe areas in the economy you're able to sort of maybe thaw the relationship, some sort of off-ramp. I don't necessarily see signs of that, but there is a history of the U.S. and China working well on broader macroeconomic stability, for example, during the
If I could interrupt for just a second.
Sure.
So you don't see signs of that. So I guess maybe a question, keeping with the topic, do you think there's more of a chance for that with an incoming Trump administration?
Potentially, yeah. Because of Trump's deal-making, desire to cut deals. I think tariffs are a given, right? You can't campaign on tariffs for 2 years, win an election, and then not do anything. So I think that's a given. But can you start to see cooperation elsewhere in the economy, like weakening export controls both ways? China opened up an investigation into NVIDIA. Do they look the other way on that? There are avenues potentially, but yeah, look, we're on track to have a really contentious economic relationship that I think is going to be pretty detrimental to both sides, right? The Chinese economy is very weak. The U.S. is coming out of a period of inflation, and you're talking about imposing 60% tariffs on all imports from China. You're going to raise relative inflation. And so I worry that we're headed toward conflict. But again, Trump wants to cut deals, so maybe there's an avenue there.
Clark, is there any way that a Trump administration would be able to bring tariffs in and avoid the inflationary spiral that so many people are warning about?
Yeah, look, obviously, you impose tariffs, it's going to raise the value of the dollar, it's going to offset some of the costs, but then you push that off to exporters, right? So U.S. exporters face more difficult circumstances abroad. I don't know what the contours of any sort of deal would be. I think the U.S. would again push for a stronger yuan. I think the U.S. would ask China to do more on IP and technology transfer. I don't know to what extent the Chinese are willing to play ball, but we did get somewhat of an off-ramp the first administration with the so-called Phase 1 deal. I don't know if there's a Phase 2 that sort of eliminates some tariffs or puts a pause on future tariff hikes. Who knows? But that would be, I guess, my best case, my hope as the best case. Obviously, in reality, right? Like, I think that obviously I think that tariffs are crazy, but I also have to deal in reality that he is going to do something on that front, and so maybe you get some sort of detente through sustained negotiation.
Eric,
I'll be a little controversial and say I actually think peaceful coexistence is more possible under Trump than it was under Biden. In the sense that I think that the big issue driving, I think, a lot of the military tension has been the Taiwan question. And I think that the way the Biden admin and the Congress, and people like Nancy Pelosi, talked about Taiwan, I think made the Chinese very nervous that the one China policy that has guided, U.S. relations on Taiwan and towards mainland China since '79 was coming apart. I think the Trump team is going to correct some of that, because I think that him and the people around him, they have an interest, I think, in supporting Taiwan. But somewhat paradoxically, I think they'll be much more careful in their, like Trump when he came in, yes, he had the phone call with Tsai Ing-wen when he was president-elect. That was publicized. Hasn't done that yet. They still have time, right? The inauguration's coming up. There's still a few days left that they could, I don't think he's going to take another call from Lai Ching-te. I think that in his rhetoric publicly, he will not say things about we will for sure always defend Taiwan no matter what, which is more in line with what U.S. policy is, right? I think Biden, I think, would still be in this sort of guardrail of the one China policy, but he was flirting near the edge. I think Trump, in his political rhetoric, will be more firmly in the middle of what, the U.S. one China policy is. The actual material side of that might be different, where I think, Taiwan will become more capable. I think that there will be this initiative to kind of help them plus up their military strength. But I think to China, the bigger problem is the political problem, and it's if you keep loudly saying how much you are going to support Taiwan, then it kind of, I think Beijing was feeling like they're backing us into a corner. And I feel like with Trump, that political end of things is going to be quieter. And you'll still have the building that, speak softly, carry a big stick is a good model to follow here. And I think the Trump team is very interested in building the stick, and he might be willing to kind of tone down the rhetoric and sort of, because if that issue can be diffused, right? If you take imminent conflict over Taiwan off the table through a mix of deterrence and assurance, that's kind of the only real thing that brings the U.S. and China into a direct war, I think. South China Sea is a sideshow, right? The big one is Taiwan. And as long as that can be kind of contained and settled and kept calm enough, all the other conflict or all the other tension can exist, but it won't explode. So I think Trump has a chance there. The other national security thing I want to say is North Korea is a bit of a wild card, right? I think that the North Korea-China relationship is, let's call it tenuous, as the North Koreans have gone closer to the Russians. If the North Koreans do something aggressive, I don't think they'd actually do this, but if they tried to do some kind of aggressive posturing or maneuvering to take advantage of political uncertainty in South Korea with, Yoon Suk-yeol getting arrested and the coup and all this other, that's a whole mess. But if something happens on the peninsula, that could be a black swan type of event that's what happens to U.S.-China relations? And I actually think U.S.-China relations, depending on if that were to happen, it could be a moment for closer cooperation.
On the rhetoric, I think Eric makes a good point, but there's also, we have concrete evidence of how this went in the first Trump administration, right? When Hong Kong passed the national security law, Bolton at the time was urging a pretty strong statement coming from the United States, and Trump was saying, no, I don't want to do anything that would disrupt any sort of trade negotiations. And the Xinjiang and forced labor issue, right? I'm not going to raise human rights. I'm not going to talk about, the issue in Hong Kong. and obviously it's slightly different, but I think there's a pretty strong analogy you can draw. And Trump being sort of transactional, look, I don't want to anger the partner across the table from me. We have all this leverage from the tariffs. So, we're not going to press on those troubling.
I was in, the last time I was in China was in January of 2020 when COVID was, weird pneumonia happening. Maybe that'll be something, maybe it won't. And I went to a sort of track 2, think tank experts and academics from the US and from China talking together. And the mood was very positive because COVID hadn't happened yet. And phase 1, the sort of subject of the discussion was, how are we going to, what are ways that the relationship can get back on track now that this phase 1 agreement has been concluded and we're moving towards it? And then COVID happens and disrupts all of that. I think that there might be some of that optimism again of like, if we can get both countries to a place of general satisfaction on some of the trade and economic issues, then things open up again for more cooperative exchanges or for something that looks not like just out of control competition. And, if COVID never happens, maybe we live in a very different world today in the US-China relationship thing, because all the stuff about like the China virus and vaccine diplomacy and all this sort of zero-sum stuff that happens because of COVID, like if that doesn't occur, I think the mood in China back in 2020, when phase 1 was concluded, was more hopeful.
Well, this has been a great discussion, guys. We're over time now. There's been some great insights. We are less than 4 days away from the inauguration, so I guess we're not far from finding out if your predictions and insights are accurate. But anyway, thank you very much. Thanks for having me over here for this great discussion, and thank you everyone for tuning into this discussion.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.